So I'm going to share for a few moments on actually one of today's lectionary readings. But I confess to you I'm a bit of a rebel sometimes, and I'm not I'm not reading it from the gospel that's given. I'm going to read it from a same story, but from a different gospel. The lectionary reading was given as Luke today, but I'm going to read from Matthew. Matthew chapter 14, and starting at verse 15, and you'll know the story well. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away." They're talking to Jesus. "Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy some food." Jesus replied, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Don't you just love it that they're not included in the numbers? So the feeding of the 5,000 is feeding of the 5,000 plus. But anyway, we won't go there. I remember well, and actually Nigel, you will remember this as well. He sits upright. When we were by the Sea of Galilee, when we were at Nazareth, we were taken down to, the places where you go where various things are said to happen or said to have happened. And we went to a place called Mensa Christi, which is where Jesus is said to have done the beach barbecue. There's a beautiful little church built over the rocks on which he could well have done a barbecue. Lovely, big, flat boulder of a rock. But then we were taken across the road because we were with people who knew the land well. And this was off the tourist trail. You remember, Nigel? We walked across the road and we walked up this little, very unassuming path, hardly anybody going up there through a gate, up this path that didn't look like it was going to go anywhere at all. And we laboured up the path because it was quite a steep hill. And as we got some way up, there was this lovely little, I don't think you could quite call it a cave, but it was certainly a kind of an opening under an overhanging rock. And now there's a little bench in there, and it's said to be one of the places where when Jesus went up into the hills to pray, that may well have been one of the places that he stopped. Because when you turn around from the labours of your walk, the view down Galilee is spectacular. And it's this quiet little spot. I could imagine Jesus stopping there and praying. But if you go on up the hill, you come to this amazing grassy flank of a hill. And there is a very natural bowl, amphitheatre type situation. And it is thought that this could possibly be one of the locations where Jesus spoke to the crowds, because the guide told us that, not with our group, but if with another group, they had sent somebody on up the hill and they just spoke in a normal voice and everybody down in the bowl could hear. So you could believe that that would be where Jesus would have given the Sermon on the Mount or fed the 5,000 or done some teaching, because people would hear and they would see him. It was beautiful, wasn't it? And it was a very special visit that we had there. So it could well have been where this particular story happened, or somewhere very like it. They'd obviously been there a while because it was getting late. And the disciples, perhaps they were hungry. Maybe they were the ones who were hungry, who said to Jesus, shouldn't we get these people to go? Because, it's getting late and they need to be fed. And Jesus says, you feed them. You feed them. And someone says, in Matthew's version, as I read, the person isn't named. In other Gospels, we get a name. But someone says, we only have 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. The implication being, they're not going to feed me, let alone this lot. Let alone this lot. It's a ridiculous thought. I wonder if you have ever been in a situation that looks impossible. However are you going to do this? However are you going to get through this? However is this going to be achieved? And you get a nudge from God and you go, well, that's not going to work, is it? That's not going to work. And maybe you didn't do it, so you'll never know. Maybe you did do it and you came away astounded. But Jesus had everyone sit down, and he took the food that was offered to him, and he blessed it, and he broke it. He gave a eulogy. That's what it means. He blessed it. He was full of thanksgiving for that bread. He honored God. He blessed the people before they shared it. And then you could almost say, well, where's the miracle here? Because he doesn't appear to have prayed. He doesn't appear to have done anything except blessed it and gave thanks. The miracle is the size of the crowd, of course, that was fed. The food was distributed to everybody. And some commentators say that these are all the same story. It's just one story, but I don't believe that at all. That actually, people were encouraged to share what they had brought because they'd all got a bit of food tucked in their back pocket that they hadn't told anybody they'd got. And so when they all said, well, actually, I've got a bit as well, it went round. I don't think that's right at all. Verse 20 that I read tells us that there were 12 baskets of bread left over. The leftovers of a meal, of course, were always what was given to the servants. So there was one for each of the disciples that we read served the people that day. So there was provision. There was provision of God for the people who were hungry that day. Everyone included, no one left out. Even the servers had enough. It's like, I think, the miracle of the flour and the oil. You remember Elijah and the widow? Where the promise was, it will not run out. It wasn't that the jar of oil and flour would be refilled every day. It was that it would not run out. And that's a very different thing if you think about it. Because if there's only that much left in the jar, rather than a jar full, and you've got to use that to make your bread tomorrow, it means that you have to really rely on God for that to be replenished the next day. You can't sit back and think, well, we're all right for a week then. You have to use it every day and trust that it will be there again tomorrow. And I think this story is a little bit like that. There was enough for the moment, enough for the day. If we move a couple of chapters further on, and I haven't put this one on the screen actually, Esther, in Matthew 15, I'm just going to read the relevant bit rather than all the bits around it. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. 2 chapters on, this is. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where can we get enough bread to feed these people? 2 chapters on. 2 chapters on. Actually, it makes me feel quite relieved, really. Where could we get enough bread? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. Different story. 7. And a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish. And when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples. And they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And afterwards the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate that day was 4,000 men, plus the women and the children. So 2 chapters on, Jesus is somewhere where there is a big crowd again. Same scenario. They've been with him a long time. He's been healing people. It says that in the verses above. He's got compassion on them, but this time he's got compassion because they're hungry. And he may have healed them, but it's beyond him to send them away hungry. They've been fed spiritually, but they can't go away hungry. And he says, what are we going to do? Where are we going to find bread? And nobody says, why don't you do what you did last time? Nobody says that. You would have thought that was the obvious thing to say, wouldn't you? Why don't you do what you did last time? Do you remember that day, Lord, that you fed 5,000? Why don't you do the same? Jesus has to ask again, what have you got? What have you got? 7 loaves and a few small fish. And he took the food offered and he fed the people. This time, though, he gave thanks. Last time he blessed it. This time he gave thanks. And we get that word Eucharist from it. This is a Eucharist, this meal. It's a bit of a prophetic echo of the Last Supper, isn't it, in lots of ways? Everybody ate, everybody was satisfied, 7 baskets left over. And you might think, well, there were 12 last time. Did 5 of the disciples go hungry then? Those sums don't work, do they? 12 baskets left over. 7 baskets left over. The difference between these 2 stories isn't how many people who were fed, and it isn't how many baskets were left over. The difference between these 2 stories is the baskets. It's the baskets. Because in the first story, the feeding of the 5,000, the 12 baskets that were left over, the baskets, the kophinos, the Greek word, lunch boxes. That's what were left over, lunch boxes. So enough for the disciples to have their own portion just like everybody else. Their lunch boxes. In the story of the 4,000 and the 7 baskets, it's a different word entirely. And I'm going to read from Acts to give you an idea of that basket. Acts 9, verse 25. This is Saul. When Saul came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. No, sorry, that's a verse too far on. After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him, but Saul learned of their plan. Day and night they kept close watch on the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a... That's not a lunchbox, is it? They're not going to lower Saul down the wall in a lunchbox through an opening in the wall. This is a hamper. This is not a lunchbox. The Greek word spiris, different word. Different stories, different baskets. 7 hampers left over. Baskets that are large enough for a man. Why had they got those hanging around up on a mountain? Do you wonder? Do you suppose it's what people who were sick were carried up in? Who've been healed and don't need to go down in them. That's why they're hanging around empty on a mountain, ready to receive the bread that's left over. The first story is a story of enough for the day. This story is abundance. It's a story of plentiful, over and above provision. Generosity on a mountain. And if you read on a chapter or two, Jesus actually talks to the disciples about these 2 occasions. And when he talks to them, he uses the 2 different words for baskets when he talks about the 2 stories. So it's very deliberate that the size of the baskets are different. So what does that say for us, really? Well, I think the first story is about the generosity of God, but in providing for us what we need for today. The second story is about the same God of provision who lavishes provision on us. And sometimes I guess there are occasions when we think, oh Lord, wouldn't it be amazing to have enough money in the bank that I didn't have to worry about it for 6 months? And he says, no, I'll give you tomorrow's. Or whatever situation that might be for you. Wouldn't it be amazing, Lord, to have energy for the next year? No, I'll give you enough for today. And I think the other thing, 2 other things to notice from these stories. Jesus can't do anything, well, he probably can because he's Lord, but he chooses not to do anything with those loaves and fish until first they are offered to him. Then he takes them and makes them plentiful. There's something in there for us, I think, about whatever it is that's going on for us. There may need to be an offering to him. And then he transforms it. Whether that's our health, our grief, our money, our tiredness, our lostness, our aloneness, whatever it might be. And the second is, it's his decision whether he gives us enough for the day or whether he lavishes us in plenty. We might long for the plenty. No, enough for the day. And in both situations, we are to be thankful for it. Because I guess the truth is that most of us, maybe I'm talking about me, if he lavished all I needed on me in riches aplenty every day, would I continue to trust him in the same way that I need to when it's a trust me for today and I'll give it to you again tomorrow? Most of us probably know ourselves well enough to know that actually that's quite tricky, isn't it? But God, who knows, will take your offering and do with it what he needs to do. Amen.